So good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to pursue the very interesting debates of this morning. And now we're going to talk about globalization versus fragmentation. And we're going to ask ourselves, where do we place value? That's really the heart of the question today. So to discuss this burning topic, I have around me 4 experts. They are so high-level experts that it takes 10 minutes to read their titles. We start with, just on my left, Andrea Goldstein, economist, head of India, Indonesia, and Tunisia desk at the OECD Economics Department. Then we have Jean-Francois Huchet, president of Inalco, professor of economics of China and Asia at Inalco. Then we have Laurent Vigier, that you saw this morning already on stage, who is chairman of the 5 Capital Executive Committee, chairman of Friends of the Global Fund Europe, and former chairman of the board of the Institutional Investors Roundtable. And then the lady at the end is called Sandra Poncet, and she's a professor at Paris School of Economics, head of the Masters in International Economy and Environment, and of the thematic group Globalization, Political Economy and Migration. Now, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history and the ultimate victory of the liberal democracy model. We thought at that time that we had entered a new era, that of a multipolar, or I should say, I was told this morning, multilateral world. And today we can see that globalization is being questioned everywhere. Populism is rising. And also we see quite a sudden increase in the risk of geoeconomic fragmentation and even, as we heard a lot about this morning, of military conflict. So the question really is, how did we get there? Over the past 3 decades, the flow of capital, goods, services, and people has transformed our world. And driven by the spread of new ideas and new technologies, these forces of integration have actually increased productivity and living standards, tripling the size of global economy and lifting 1.3 billion people out of extreme poverty. But at the same time, globalization has also created new issues. Inequalities in income, wealth, opportunity have continued to grow within the countries, and this has been for quite a while already, and more recently also among the countries which were supposed to not be in this situation. A portion of the population has been left behind as industries have begun to change in the face of global competition. And moreover, this population feel that their states, their governments are powerless and can't help them. As a result, on the political side, we are seeing the rise of populism, as we were talking, and on the economic side, the return of the states, driving trends like reindustrialization, relocation, trends around also national sovereignty. We've seen this particularly with industrial policies in semiconductors, batteries, medicines, social issues, energy, environmental policies. And at the same time, we see tensions over trade, technological standards, and security increasing. Clearly, the desire to reconfigure globalization is there. And the increased fragmentation of the world space is creating multiple zones of influence that are actually encouraging shortening and regionalization of supply chains. What's more, and this is what we heard a lot about this morning, the trade tensions and the rivalry between China and the United States on all fronts, military, economic, technological, as well as the war in Ukraine, have accentuated a big move of de-Westernization that does not only concern the productive and financial spheres, but also affect mentalities, norms, values, and all that underlie actually the rest of it. The war in Ukraine, in turn, sounds like the evidence somehow of the failure of globalization. If we were to summarize, I would say that it looks like the international order that we inherited from World War II is maybe collapsing, with its key institutions like WTO or the United Nations unable to reform themselves. And meanwhile, we see China, and again, something we heard a lot about this morning, establishing parallel, and maybe we should not say parallel, but competitive organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Belt and Road Initiative. And what is paradoxical is that all we are describing now is happening at a moment of acute global challenges, like climate change and pandemics, obviously, that would, on the reverse, call for increased cooperation at global level. So we all feel a sense of emergency in the face of a situation like the one I just described. And we are all occupied with key questions about actually what we could say without being grandiloquent, the future of humanity. Are we going to go towards more fragmentation? Would this result, as a lot of us fear, or a lot of people fear, in a more dangerous and also poorer world? Could even result in world conflict, as we discussed a lot this morning? Is there a way we can remodel globalization and redefine the way we cooperate in order to respond more effectively to these collective challenges? This is really what we want to discuss today in the next hour or so, before I open the questions to the floor. So I will ask a first question to all of you, and each of you will have reasonable time to answer the first question as well as the other questions. So the first one would go like this. So if we listen to some, as we said, globalization is to be praised for having lifted 1.3 billion people out of extreme poverty. But then for others, it is the source of our problems, and the problems come from globalization. What has led to this current situation, and what has led to this questioning of globalization? Is globalization itself to be blamed for the current situation? So that's my first question. And maybe yeah, okay. I will start with Sandra.
So indeed, I think that the critics of globalization will start by saying that anytime you allow countries to compete, it could result in a race to the bottom. This is the language they use, where countries will end up undercutting each other's wage and labor standards, and that would leave poor and rich alike worse off. Okay? But my interpretation, I think a better or more accurate description of what is going on with globalization is rather a race to the top, where almost, if you look at statistics, almost every country is richer today than they were in the 80s, before globalization gathered momentum. So when you think about the period of hyper-globalization, I think that we can put dates there, 1986 to 2008, where suddenly the crisis occurred. I think that in that period of time, there was an unbundling of manufacturing process. There's a variety of reasons related to information and communication technology change, reduction of trade costs. It was really the period where man-made trade barriers were reduced through regional trade agreements, WTO, negotiation, China's entry in WTO in 2001. And there were also political developments that made almost the whole world population participate in the capitalist system. So with that, we had a peaceful international context. And so integration, trade integration was viewed as a way to make people connect more and possibly to converge economically and possibly politically. Okay, but during that time, I think that the feature allowed some kind of combination between low wage in developing countries and high tech, because firms were able to offshore some tasks in their production process, but high-skilled tasks, relatively, and so they were able to push industrialization in what became emerging economies, like China, India, and so on. And so what we saw is very rapid rise of those emerging countries, and this didn't occur to the detriment of developed countries who kept on growing. Even low-income countries kept on growing, and even middle-income countries kept on growing, even though it was less dense. So to me, gains occurred across the world income distribution. And so we could not say that lower-income countries did not get richer at the expense of rich economies, or enriching high-income economies came at the expense of the developing world. So it was not a zero-sum gain, it was a positive sum gain. And so to me, when we think about opening up markets, it comes with lower poverty and convergence across countries. And so the reversal that we see in building is jeopardizing that in terms of greater prosperity. That being said, economic globalization doesn't increase, it increases many income, but not all, and not to the same extent. So there's increasing inequality building up, even across countries to some extent, because when you gain, the gains you get from globalization depends at your stage of globalization. So new entrants get access to the low-hanging fruits of becoming more efficient, and so they will gain a lot. Rich countries, those that are already globalized, there are only very marginal gains to obtain. Okay, so it means that if we keep on globalizing, the richer country will see no more. Not much more to get, but there are still a lot of gains for the low-income countries. And then I think, which is the most important part, is the distribution within countries. And this is where potentially you can explain backlash against globalization. So clearly, while there are substantial income gains, they seem to be reaped by the top level of income, so the richest people, especially in the developed countries. And so globalization doesn't seem to be that inclusive. However, to make it short, since it makes the richest gain more, you could think in terms of redistribution as a way to ensure that globalization becomes inclusive. Okay, so there's room for redistribution, but that's really, the economics say this, then it's the job of politicians to make that happen. But also, since redistribution, taxes and transfers will possibly not offset everything, there's one dimension which is very important, and that has been shown by various studies, be it in the OECD or in the IMF. It's the very important role of education, to make sure that the least educated don't fall behind, and that the gains from globalization accrue to everyone. So in short, there are gains from economic globalization, but the policymakers need to make it especially inclusive. Now, if I can just make a small point on, is globalization, should we blame globalization for the current situation? My view is a bit different. Of course, when we contemplated shortages in supermarkets, many thought that if that had happened 20 years or 30 years ago, we would not have such shortages because we were self-sufficient in a way. And if we were capable of reshoring, then this would be the solution. But my perception is rather the opposite. In absence of globalization, I mean, there would not have been such a rapid adjustment. When I think of mustard, for example, of course it vanished for 2 weeks. But then you saw mustard coming from, I mean, very, exotic countries that came back. And so the smooth functioning of supply chain is really what saved us in a way. And to me, further down the road, maybe history will recall the global supply chains or the global value chains as the heroes of those disruptions, because they are the ones that have solved and make that period of time shorter.
Well, it's very clear views on globalization. So if I hear you, it's overall positive. It has made the whole world richer. Yes, it has increased inequalities, and this could potentially be solved by some political decisions around redistribution and education. But even when you look at the current crisis, you think actually that globalization helps rather than the other way around. Very interesting perspective. Would be interesting to listen to you, Laurent Vigier. What's your perspective on this sort of broad question? Is it to blame or to praise overall?
Okay, I don't like to frame the debate between blaming or praising, because globalization, it's not like the gravity, or it's not a natural movement. It's the result of a series of political decisions, of an intellectual framework put in, implemented and developed, and it has roots. What we call globalization, basically, and that's where you say political values and economic values connect, is that when we talk about modern globalization, you see, which is maybe the third or maybe the fourth globalization in history. We had the colonial period, we had the globalization before World War I, we had the globalization that aborted after World War I, and with this fragmentation, the establishment of the imperial tariff by the UK, or the area of the zone of co-prosperity by the establishment of the Japanese Empire, so in a way the preparation to World War II. And you had some economists like Keynes that say, okay, in order to establish the basis of peace, you need to create the basis of trade. And with the creation of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade in 1947, and there was the idea that after World War II, we need to rebuild an international system based on the United Nations, but also on trade. Then you had the Cold War, and you had only trade between the West, countries around the US, and you had the establishment of European communities, but you had the Comecon on the East, and you have different systems. After the end of the communism in 1991, then there was this idea that it was maybe time to finish the job of 1947, and there was the Marrakesh Conference and the establishment of the WTO. And the idea was that after the end of communism, it was time to extend the international system, to complement the WTO, the United Nations, now functioning with all the power, the communist power, the Soviet Union becoming Russia, being integrated in the system, and creating a level playing field for the expansion of trade, and hence the movement of liberalization and so on. The question is that when we embarked on this journey, it was not complete. There was a lot of, I would say, some shortcomings. For example, the Western countries, they put a lot of exemptions. Even if we say we are in favor of free trade, we had a lot of exemption, being for agriculture, being for other issues. Say, okay, intellectual property, for example, access to drug was a big issue. We defend our interest. And in the way that the international trade system worked, there was something which is not very well understood, but that the basis for the international trade system is not openness. It's protectionism. The way you build a trade agreement is by an exchange and balance of concessions. You see, I reduce my tariff on some sector, provided you you reduce your export subsidies for agriculture. And then you have a balance. And when we talk about sanctions in the trade sector, is that if one country, if one member of the system say, okay, now I want to protect and I reduce unilaterally the concession I've accepted in a negotiation, then the other members of the system are allowed to reduce the level of openness. And it's a rebalancing of the system. That's why the sanctions, when we talk about sanctions in the trade system, it's very different of the sanctions which are implemented for political reason by the United States or by the European Union in political disputes. Even if they have the trade impact, it's not the way, sometimes it's not very well understood. And something very important occurred in 2001. In 2001, and I was a member of the French delegation in Doha for the launch of the Doha round, just after 9/11. 9/11, we remember, it was an attack against a symbol of trade, the World Trade Center. And in Doha at that time, okay, we need to launch the Doha round and finish the word of liberalization, globalization. The Doha round was launched in 2001 and aborted in 2013. It never was completed. And the other things that occurred, it was bringing China within the WTO and integrating China to the global trade system. So we had basically an imbalance in the system. We kept a lot of protectionism barriers. We started to see that they had some interest to protect, and at the same time, we brought to the system a country that in a few years' time raised from the side of the Dutch economy to the side of the US economy. And it has created major imbalances of the system, created a lot of tensions, and all the reform of the international system, which was considered at that time. So the reform of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the creation of the global round, the Doha round, and next round of none of this has been eventually achieved. So basically, we continue to press on this direction, but it was unbalanced. And now what we arrived at a system where eventually we had some of the people, we have some overall, there is the overall weight of nation has increased due to this period, but a lot of imbalances has been created, including in our own societies. The working class has been displaced and relocated in Asia, and in particular in China. So we thought, okay, that's not a problem because the middle class are going to arise, we're going to have intellectual property, and we're going to keep the value because the production's going to be in China, but we're going to have intellectual property, so no problem, no strikes with the workers, but for the shareholders, we keep the result. It does not work that way. It's that we started to weaken the workers, the working class in the West, and the Rust Belt in the US, the demise of the textile industry in Europe, for example. But also now we see that the Chinese, they are climbing above, on the value chain, and now intellectual property, they are very performing. So now we feel that also the middle class, which is the fabric of our democracies, are basically weakened also. So we started from the value, an ideological project, and this implementation, because it was not completely managed, eventually created the disequilibrium. And what we see now is that there's, again, questioning of globalization, risk of fragmentation. Fragmentation can bring back war. And the big question is how far it's going to happen. Are we going back to the imperial tariff, a European zone, a US zone, a China zone, or are we going to keep some kind of overlapping cooperation that's going to maintain a certain degree of openness of the system? And for me, it's a big question we have.
Sure, and we will get to this question, actually. Yeah. So if I hear you well, what you're saying is that it's the how that has not been right, implementation, but a lot of the imbalances that came from the wrong implementation or the partially wrong implementation were actually increased and accelerated by the entry of China in this system through the access to WTO. So I'm sure that Jean-Francois Huchet will want to react to this when answering the question himself.
Yes, thank you. And I think quite a lot has already been said, but I think when we are looking for reasons why we are in this current situation, I think, as you said, we can first look at what happened in the North, or I would say in Western countries. And I think that, well, the word disindustrialization has been perceived by different actors in different social groups in a very harsh way, as you said. But the loss also of competencies in some industries. Also look at what happened, obviously, in the nuclear industry for France, where we had so many problems to find, for example, welder, and it cost us billions of euros and delay in our ability, for example, to build a nuclear plant. And those things happen also at the same time when we had countries who have maintained a quite powerful industrial policy. And I think it goes also on a more theoretical level, because I think, for example, if you take the example of the European Union, I'm not talking about the United States, because the US has been able to maintain some barriers to entry and also to really counteract during the past 30 years. But the European Union, for example, has been really applying the rules of what we learn when you learn economics, the theory of competitive advantage. We really lower the barriers to entry in terms of trade, in terms of investment. And we discovered a few years later that if you do that, but with other countries maintaining very powerful industrial policy, then you suddenly have a problem. And remember, we already have an alert with Japan in the 80s. I mean, you probably remember in this room, remember some American senators who were destroying cars. We had also in France some people who were destroying also VCR in Poitiers, if I remember well, at that time in the 80s, because they thought that you had no reciprocity in the rules. And I fully agree with you, because after Japan came Korea, on a lesser scale, but nevertheless very powerful, Taiwan. But China changed entirely, I think, the rule of the game here, because it happened on a much bigger scale. And I think China had also something that the other one didn't have to sell or didn't want to sell, like Japan, was the internal market. And I think they were able to bargain technology transfer up to a point that no country would have imagined to do, because Japan, we have to remember that Japan was under the nuclear umbrella with the US, and that the US wanted to transfer some technology in the 50s and in the 60s. But for China, when you remember the position of China in the 70s, there was nothing obvious in the capacity of China to actually not only transfer, but to digest so many foreign technology. So it brings me to actually to the rule who are set for free moving of capital. And I think we have to come back, as you said, to the situation we had in the 30s. We have all to remember that you had some destructive devaluation in the 30s, and after the war, well, Keynes decided during Bretton Woods session that, well, we had to to have an agreement on not only financial rules but also trade rules, and well, the United States was there to actually to represent the hegemon to maintain those rules. So if we come back to those rules, what are the reasons why capital, for example, would not move freely anymore? And I think we have it in front of our eyes, is geopolitical tensions, wars, or destructive competition, or seen as destructive, like China is, for example, trying to do at the moment, or at least China wants to be less dependent on the world, but wants the world to be more dependent from China. So automatically it raised some reciprocity demand from Europe, which is changing extremely rapidly in terms also of industrial policy, becoming less naive on certain issue with China. So I think COVID in a way plays like a catalyzer on the evolution, which were already existing for some time before what happened in 2020. Does globalization has to be blamed for the current situation? I think it was inevitable because if you would like to play with the rules, it doesn't work like that. I mean, we have to remember that some experts of the World Bank came to South Korea in the 50s and said, well, if you apply competitive advantage, you have to specialize in rice production. Hopefully, the South Korean government did not listen to the World Bank expert and decided to build their competitive advantage and close the domestic market, have a very powerful industrial policy, and to build step by step its industrial capacity and its competitive advantage. So obviously we have reached to the point now with China that this cannot continue like that, because you talk about the possibility to have two hegemons now at the moment who maybe are setting different rules, and obviously it cannot continue. It cannot continue like that. We will, and I think it is the second part of the question we will discuss afterwards.
So again, I hear China, by the way it does things, but also by just its mere size and the impact of its size, was quite an accelerator on this overall unbalance. But what I also hear, unless I misunderstood, is that some countries have been more naive in terms of playing the rules and playing the game than others. And what I hear is that probably Europe has been the most naive one. Now, Andrea Goldstein, what do you have to tell us about this?
Well, the advantage of being the last is that I don't have to invent anything. The disadvantage is that you have heard everything already. So I will take, being the only non-French here, I will take a very French attitude and have a very Cartesian presentation with 10 points. Now, but I won't take too much of your time. Now, the first point I think is that actually globalization fragmentation is the same as globalization. I mean, we cannot think of fragmentation of globalization as we know it without thinking of the modularization of production, which is fragmentation. So in a way, the more fragmentation, the more modularization, the more globalization. And this is probably something that has definitely happened over the past 30 years or so, and will increasingly happen even more so because services are an important component of the production of goods, and services themselves, of course, are being modularized increasingly. The second point is very much echoing what others have said, is that we are not witnessing an end of globalization. In fact, if you look at it's always difficult to build indices, but the Swiss Economic Research Institute, KOF, has an index of globalization, and which is itself divided into two components. One is the de jure globalization, and the other is the de facto globalization. In both accounts, globalization has increased permanently and uniformly over the past 30 years, even if, of course, the pace of the increase in the globalization indices is slowing down because there's less. I mean, once you reach 100, which we haven't reached yet, but once we reach 100, of course, you cannot go much beyond that. The third point, because I already have 10 points, I was not joking, is that, and this I echo very much what Sandra said, that globalization in absolute terms has definitely produced positive results, especially if we look in terms of poverty reduction. Obviously, poverty reduction has been very much concentrated in China and India, but at the same time, obviously, those were the countries where most of the poor lived 30 or 20 years ago. Now, India, which is kind of my country these days, remains the poorest country in the world in terms of the number of poor people. Having said that, of course, the incidence of poverty in India has decreased over the past 20 years, even if India is not the most global of the global countries. So that also means also that the potential, again, maybe I will return to India later on, but the potential of globalization in India to reduce poverty hasn't been exploited fully. But obviously, the counterpart to that, again, as Sandra said, is that inequality within countries has increased. I mean, obviously, we all know of the work by Piketty, Science, and other, mostly French scholars, but not only. And that is obviously one big concern, because you're happy to know that there are a few people that are poor in India, in China, but if you live in Paris and you're relative position is worsening, it's a very small consolation. Now, this is linked to the fact that the price convergence, which is actually a very important dimension of globalization, has operated to some extent, because there's been a convergence, a relative convergence in the wages, which is the price of one of the factors of production, and an even greater convergence of interest rates, even if, of course, there's an element of risk. I mean, interest rate, the price of capital is risk adjusted, and risk remains larger in emerging economies. So I don't know whether this is the sixth or the seventh point. I'm afraid this is still the sixth. We have seen, obviously, and this is obvious to all of us, the increasing role of emerging economies in the global scene. And this is obviously something which is somehow frightening, because for very simple cognitive reasons, we tend to see with greater fear things or people or counterparts that are distant that we don't know too much about. So emerging economies and the place in the global economy are one factor of globalization which explains the rise of anti-globalization tendencies. And now it's China mostly, yes, indeed. In fact, if you remember, 20 years ago, Jim O'Neill, the economist at Goldman Sachs, invented the acronym BRICS, and of this BRICS, BRIC, which then became BRICS with South Africa, but these BRICS actually have wither away, because we are left to some extent with China only. The other countries are, even in different reasons, in a state of crisis. I will maybe cut from 10 to fewer, and I will conclude with 2, so that I have time to go back to the others later on. One big change, of course, over the past 20 years or so has been in terms of in terms of the cultural hegemony, Gramsci cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony in the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was basically TINA. There is no alternative. And this is the basic arguments of Fukuyama. There is no alternative to neoliberalism or to neoliberal thinking, and as a result, there is no price in trying to find another one. Now we have seen the pendulum shifting very markedly because of, obviously, globalization, because of the financial crisis, most recently because of the COVID pandemic, with basically 2 things happening which are very much interlinked. One is that the role of the state is recognized as being very important, and as a result, certain policies and certain attitudes also are now accepted in a way that 20 years ago were not. And I think, obviously, we are in a space of thinking and confronting ideas. So the idea that the hypothesis that ideas are very important in determining policy choices is very central. And obviously, so the discussions that may appear to be very removed from reality about the ideas, about the values, in fact, principles, in fact, are very important. Which leads me to the last point, which is on multilateralism. Now, I work for the OECD, so no prize for guessing that I think that multilateralism, or in the case of the OECD, plurilateralism, has a big contribution to make. Now, in fact, I think this shift from multilateralism, which is universal, to plurilateralism, which is inclusive, but still it cannot be universal, is something that we're going to see. And obviously the first example is the work on taxes, on the BEPS, tax harmonization. And at the OECD is a good example of something that is central to the policy debate, which is central for the future of globalization, and where the agreement has been reached at the plurilateral level, not at the multilateral level. And then finally, just wanted to reassure Laurent about the demise of the textile industry. My tie is made in Italy.
It's possible. Yes, that's true. But what is interesting that somehow you all have a slightly different perspective. But what I read through your different perspectives, and if you don't agree with my understanding, please let me know, is that, of course, all of you stress the benefits the globalization had on basically enabling a number of people in the world to go from extreme poverty to a more pleasant life. But what you're also saying is that somehow, one way or the other, implementation has not gone totally right. But actually, this was not a major issue until globalization has really achieved its goal with China. And this is where China comes back in the picture, because where globalization, from what I hear from you, has achieved very visible goal is with China. And now that China has reached this point, it creates a problem for globalization. This is what I hear across everything you said, which I think is a very interesting perspective, because in turn, this increases indeed the questioning and the decline of globalization, which is being questioned not only by those who now may potentially suffer from it, which are not China, but also by China itself. Which is a little bit paradoxical, but an interesting point. So are we going to see more and more of this, more and more decline of globalization and increasing fragmentation? Or is this leading to increasingly bad international relationship, both in trade and politically? Should we fear a third world war? Or are there really corrections we can rapidly bring to a situation that, as someone said, was inevitable, because actually somehow the situation is the product of what we wanted it to be, that is to lift 1.4 billion, but not quite, out of poverty. And that was happening in China primarily. So maybe we change. Shall I start with you, or to just make sure you don't have to? No? Yeah? Oh, okay. That's up to you. Okay, Sandra, go ahead. Sandra, go ahead. I just wanted a bit of fairness in this tough world, but...
Okay, so it seems that the question is, are we in a process of deglobalization first? I mean, I'd like to make a few points on this. So I didn't count the bullet points, but so here I'm going to borrow a lot from Richard Baldwin, who has worked extensively on this question. And so what we can do is take data. Okay, and so the typical way to measure globalization would be first to compute a ratio, trade of goods, for example, over GDP. And if you look at the data, indeed, from 1960, we were at 19%, to 1993, we were at 30%. And we reached somehow a peak in 2008, before the crisis, at 50%. And now we are around 42%. So there's a sense that indeed we have had this very rapid globalization, and that we reach the peak and we go down. However, I think that when you look at data a bit closer, you see two things. I think that rather than a peak, in a sense, maybe that was the peak that was, in fact, abnormal. Why? Because there was an unsustainable rise in China's globalization. At a point, China trade ratio reached 60%. I mean, it's huge. In the EU or in the US, we are around 20 to 30%. So, in fact, it's really the Chinese peak that materialized in the world peak. And so this was irrational in a way, and it makes sense that we go back to something which is more normal, I would say. The second thing is that a big part of the relapse, and actually the turnaround of China, didn't materialize in 2008. It was a bit earlier, so this is not due to the global crisis. So it's a part of the normalization of China, and it's also something which relates to prices. After 2008, in fact, there has been a strong drop in the price of energy and minerals. And so we can attribute 60% of the decline in terms of the trade ratio to this pure price effect. So when you think about price effect, since we are now observing, the rise again of mineral and energy prices, we should naturally expect that the trade ratio will again go up. Okay? But you understand that has nothing to do with really globalization, global value chains. I mean, it's just a price effect. What is, however, happening, I think, is that, so it was not really a peak, okay, but there's still something that is stabilizing. Why? Because I think we are ending up a phase, and this phase was this offshoring expansion that I was telling you about, where firms had the capacity, the technical capacity to unbundle some parts of their production process and make it offshore and make it typically produced in China, where the labor was cheaper. And so this has happened. So there has been, what was offshoreable has been offshored. And so the low-hanging fruits have been ripped. And so now, we have reached a new equilibrium. Okay? At the same point, I think what is also happening, nevertheless, is that some countries start to realize that they are vulnerable. Some firms also start realizing that they are vulnerable. So there's a tendency for firms to stop purchasing inputs from faraway origins, also because those origins become more expensive also. And so there's a kind of, I would not say reshoring, but at least so Paul Antras, was another economist, called that an unwinding of the global value chains. Okay, so they are, after having super long and tight, stretched to the maximum, they are somehow relaxing. So in short, you understand that the reality of deglobalization, I think, is a bit ambiguous. And there's another dimension which I think is, in fact, very important, and especially more important for the future, is the fact that so far I only talked about trading goods. And what is happening now is really the globalization of services. The fact that globalization in services continues to happen. And in fact, the problem is we have a lot of difficulty to really measure it, because there are a lot of services embedded in the goods themselves. And so the official statistics would put services at roughly 20% of all trade. But a recent study that I've seen of McKinsey put it at 50%. Once you take into account everything which is free, the free services that are given to clients, provided that they buy the goods. And so, in fact, what is happening is that you have very, very rapid growth in business services, notably, and there's no expectation that it would stop. Why? Well, first, because there's no limiting factor when you think about it. The demand, I mean, you can try to stuff people with refrigerators and banana. After all, they just collapse, right? But feed them with, services, business services for firms. The demand is almost infinite. And the same for also supply, right? Because there are many countries where you don't need to have physical institutions, physical factories. Also, and I think this is very interesting, the digitech is really helping trade in services. And so the main limitation of trade in services is in fact really the technological limitation. Why? Because there are hardly any regulatory barriers to trade in services. So it's true that if I want to see a doctor, he has to be certified, and there's a lot of regulation on the doctor. But he may use, some guy that is located in India to just do all the analysis of my blood checks and everything. And in fact, he will offshore part of his activity, and I will not see it. And there's no regulation on who is going to do his administrative works or the scanning and everything. And so in a sense, to me, we are not at all in a deglobalization mode. We are roughly in a globalization mode, but roughly, I mean, mostly in services, which so far we don't yet see. But that's the future.
Okay, so it's interesting and probably a little bit surprising for some of us. What you're saying is that in spite of all what we hear on deglobalization, increased fragmentation, at least when it comes to international trade of goods and services, there is no such thing, and globalization has only increased. So all the issues we're talking about do not prevent globalization to continue its increase, correct? Okay, so okay, I understand. So, Laurent, what's your view on this?
Well, the landscape, and I completely agree with what you said, is much more complex than it used to be. It's you see that trade in services continue to develop, international investments or cross-border investments also continue to develop, even if there are some reluctance, some regulations that are put in place, in particular because there's this concern about maintaining some sovereignty on key sectors. First, historical experience proved that liberalization, free trade has created a lot of wealth. And it has been a powerful driver to bring a lot of people out of poverty. This is completely an unfinished business, because even if China has not been completely lifted out of poverty, there is a huge amount of poor people in India, and India has maintained a lot of protectionist barriers. You have a lot of poor in Africa, and they ask for more access to the global market. And you see that protectionism in Latin America is not something that is really successful economically. So this idea that there's still some scope to more liberalization, more development of international exchanges, obviously there is, and obviously it's a necessity. Now there's also the degree of social acceptability, because you see when you look here, for example, in Europe, well, delocalization, destruction of industrial works created an anti-globalization constituency. But now, if you look, for example, the concern about the environment, about saving the planet, now you have people flight shaming, for example, short supply chain. This is something which is that's something which was called already when started the WTO negotiation in the 90s and the 80s, non-trade barriers. Some of them were technical, some of them, and the emerging countries at this time were very worried about the insistence of OECD countries on the environmental standards or the job standards, because they say, okay, it's protectionism in disguise. But we have to recognize that it represents a strong social demand. And it's very important in a way or another to accommodate that. When we talk about, for example, a carbon tax at the borders, external borders of the European Union, it's also a way to see that there is a political, a social demand for something like that, and it's create a barrier to trade. So I think it's really a balanced thing. But we are going to have probably a more complex. So the idea that we're going to arrive to a level playing field, I don't believe that. I think we're going to have some areas which are going to be more integrated, going to be trade with a high degree of integration. And we are going to have a more transactional relations between these big areas. And one of the questions is that what will remain for the multilateral system? What can be the role of the WTO, for example, in such a system? Is it more the European Union and the series of free trade agreements concluded between the European Union and other areas of the world? Is it what the Chinese are trying to build? And there are regions in the world which are really playing the balance between these areas. And that's where also geopolitics arrive, because basically it's where, for example, the Middle East is clearly now a region which is in balance between these different zones.
Jean-François, what's your view on all this?
Well, I think there are some new elements which are really coming in the middle of discussion nowadays. And I think, obviously, the geopolitical situation is one of them. When you look at the demand now coming from firms, multinational, to know a little bit more about the geopolitical situation, it's really obvious that even 5 to 10 years ago, it was something which was considered as not very important because you had a certain stability there. But I think what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, where you have multinational who are obliged to leave in a few weeks, it's something which really is raising a lot of questions for different multinationals. Or when you have, for example, in China, some campaign against, because you don't want to be aligned with the Chinese government on what's happening in Xinjiang, you can have also a campaign against multinationals. So I think those issues now have been brought back in the middle also of the discussion. But again, I'd like to come back on what I was saying before. When you have some competing views on the organization of the international economic system, when you have two hegemons who have different views how to organize the overall system, then it creates, in some way, some vicious circle. Because and we see it obviously between US and China. So far, the sanctions are not so far materializing in decreasing trade. Investment is not exactly true because the investment of China in US has been decreasing extremely rapidly. But I think it is a real problem. But so far, I don't think we have reached a stage of having, and I would agree with both of you in saying that we've reached a stage where you will have a long period of fragmentation. Because first, I think China also has a lot to lose in this game. I think we have to keep in mind that so far the competing institutional building made by China through the BRICS institution, yes, it's true, has been probably the most important attempt since 1945. But so far, when you look at it, it is by no way in the capacity to contest the Bretton Woods institution. I think they were there more to put pressure on the US to raise the bargaining with the US, for example, at the IMF, to have more space for that. But look at what's happening now with the management of the debt of the new Silk Road countries. I mean, China is going probably to work with the Paris Club to resolve those problems. So I don't think China is already in that capacity to have a full steam move to build its own competing system. On the other part, I think, and sometimes with some hypocrisy, countries and multinational have a lot to lose also in this fragmentation evolution. Because if you take the example of China, I don't think you can find any other countries who can combine a big market and also industrial capacity, which offer on the spot subcontracting capabilities for any multinational So what we have seen from the evolution from the made in China to the made by China is also a very impressive capability that China can give also to multinationals to build industrial capacity. It's in own country. So even if you look at the latest figures, yes, you have a kind of I would say a plateau, probably in terms of foreign direct investment in China. It is, and I would tend to agree with what Sandra has been saying, because you see services increasing quite rapidly also in China. I would like also to mention the existence also of some quite powerful restoring forces still existing. I mean, we would have to wait after the Congress, the CCP Congress, which is opening on the day after tomorrow. We will have also to wait what will happen also in the war between Russia and Ukraine. I think also China was very much impressed also by the unity between the US and Europe in terms of sanction, if China would have in mind to attack Taiwan, for example. So at the end of the day, I think we still have some tension remaining inside the system. And I fully agree with you about this social dimension, the demand for more ethics. Environmental reasons also are going to be very powerful reasons why we will probably see some slowing trends or decreasing trends in some sectors. But I think unless we would have a complete meltdown comparable to what we had during the Second World War, I don't think we're going to have really a continuing fragmentation which would lead us to a new situation. I think it will be tension remaining, but also adaptation from countries and different also situation according to different sectors.
A bit of optimism. Thank you. Andrea.
Okay, I have my 7 points this time around, and I will bring you back to some pessimism. So no, seriously. The first point is, again, I think on fragmentation. I think that deglobalization may be happening, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a defragmentation, because the same logic applies internally. In the case of China, in the case of OECD countries, obviously, I mean, the defragmentation, again, the modularization of production is something that we are here, it's here to stay, and we have to live with it in the longer run, which relates to the second point, which is that one of the reasons why there is increasing opposition to globalization, even in developing and emerging economies, is because of the phenomenon of premature deindustrialization, which Danny Roderick, the Turkish economist at Harvard, has pioneered work on, which means that the countries are becoming, have reached the top of their manufacturing contribution to GDP at a much lower stage of development than it was the case in the past. So and to the extent that manufacturing is where really a lot of the, not only of the productive innovation, but also of the social innovation takes place, that is a frightening somehow or negative phenomenon, which explains why, again, you have this opposition to, or at least concerns about globalization, even in poorer countries. Now, in the case of our countries, it has also to do with the fact that the phenomenon of the emergence of emerging economies and their increasing role in the economy is not only in trade of goods and services, but more and more in terms of innovation and in terms of foreign investment. That is what frightens, I guess, the public opinion in the West, for lack of better terms, is that you have the feeling that this is unfair, because our companies, when they go to China and the other emerging economies, they are ripped off their industrial property, whereas these companies from China, for instance, Huawei is an example, that are patenting more and more. They are protected when they invest in or when they produce in the West, in Europe, in the United States. And the same even for sure in the case of international investment, so acquisition of European companies by Chinese company, is seen with a lot of concern and skepticism, because the same conditions, the free condition of investing in Europe, do not apply to European companies that do it in China. So there is the issue of competitive neutrality, the level playing field that I refer to, and I think this is a very important issue. Now, which relates to, obviously, I think the elephant in the room is that this, again, China, but not only China, these are not the democratic systems, at least in the way that we define a democracy, which, of course, is open for the colloquium next year of the Asian Society. And but obviously, we see this, and again, to the extent that these non-democratic features of the political system are reflected in the relationship between business and the state, we, again, are very concerned about investment made by firms, again, not only from China, but also from other emerging economies. Two more points, and then I conclude. I think, now, there is a big difference also with respect to the past in terms of, and again, something that was mentioned about the dependence not only of us on them, but also of China and the rest of emerging Asia on Europe and the OECD countries in general. Just think that in 1989, trade between the US and the SSR Soviet Union was equal in the whole year, was equal to trade between China and the US on a single day 30 years later. So the level of interdependence compared to the past is like 365 times higher. So that's obviously something that makes a difference, which is one of the reasons why it may be premature to think of a third world war. I mean, obviously we don't want a third world war, but it's maybe it's I guess rational to think about the possibility of that happening, but it's probably premature to think that it will happen. And now a last point, which has to do with again both the non-democratic political systems and with multilateralism. Certainly the attempt to build a new system around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the new Bank for Development, or the Belt and Road Initiative. They have, if not failed, certainly they have not reached the results that the Chinese leadership expected a few years ago, which is probably why now China in particular is attempting another route, which is somehow more covert, which is to occupy more and more management roles, leadership roles in international agencies within the UN system. I mean, the numbers are pretty impressive. I mean, there are institutions that even at OECD or another UN system, you don't even know they exist, and where the Chinese are occupying more and more positions, they are providing more and more voluntary contribution, so occupying a larger, contributing a larger share of the total. And that's also true, for instance, for the FAO, which is, I mean, these days, obviously, for food security reasons, is an important institution where, again, China has mounted a campaign last year to have one of them. And there's nothing wrong, of course, in the fact that the second largest economy in the world is powerful in UN agencies, but there is certainly a strategy behind, which, again, may be legitimate, but is something that we may wish to discuss and remember.
Okay, now, because I would like to keep a little bit of time for Q&A, I would suggest that we answer just in a few words the last question, which is basically if you were asked to give some advice on how to best reconfigure globalization so that we can reduce or mitigate the tensions and the issues that you have all described, what would be the advice? Just maybe we start with you, Andrea, just for a change.
Point, which is to raise the salary of OECD officials, but otherwise, no. I mean, seriously, I think that there is a space to improve the functioning of international institutions, and I think one key element would be to make the G20, which is by now something which is like a substitute for the Security Council or whatever, to make it focus on giving precise political mandates to international agencies to develop rules on certain issues. Because international agencies are very technical, the G20 is by definition very political, and building a bridge between the two, I think, would be one ideal way for advancing in the quest for solutions for global problems.
Okay. Jean-Francois.
It's always difficult to give advice, but I think China will remain central to this globalization process, and I don't think we will, either from China or for other countries and multinational, as I said, China will stay a very important country. I think concessions
on both parts
will be important also to survive and also to see a much better organization of the system. We already said it, some more ethical probably behaviors from multinational are also expected in our countries, but I think also in China, because when you see the evolution of the middle class, also there is a demand also in terms of environment on certain and also issues related to labor issues. So yes. Those concessions are going to be hard to obtain, probably in this context of competing hegemons, but they are needed if we want also not to fall into a vicious circle that we have already witnessed, unfortunately, in other periods of our history.
Laurent?
I think two things. First, I think we need to complete the reform of the international system put in place, and in particular the United Nations. I think you're perfectly right that the alternative system that China has tried to develop is not in a position to replace, and it's certainly not desirable. But we have an international, universal international system. We need to make it really universal and really to complete the reform of the international organization, because this is dramatically lacking, to have a forum where all the issues, and the G20 in a way is a substitute. The UN should be really reinvested and renovated. Second things, I think there are global challenges facing everybody. They have an economic dimension, it's a transition towards a green economy, it's the fight against the global pandemics, it's completing the fight against poverty, and this should really bring together the international community, and that's where probably we can find common grounds with China. But for this, we need China to take its full responsibility. You cannot pretend to become one of the co-hegemon and not behaving completely like a responsible player in the international system.
Sandra?
So maybe a word on the danger of blaming globalization. I think there's a lot of cheap talking by politicians who want to pretend that they're going to do many things, reshore, bring back jobs. But concretely, I mean, they won't do it. I mean, in some very key sectors related to possibly health domain, digital, energy, there will be, strong commitment, investment by governments. But for many other things, I mean, we won't bring back textile jobs. And so the problem is, if you make the public believe that globalization is the enemy, and the policymakers themselves, in fact, shoot themselves in the foot by making the public that they will do something, I think it creates a very dangerous cycle of impossible expectations that could backlash. And to me, what is very important is to see that globalization could be an ally that would provide a virtuous dynamics where firms are asked by the public and the consumers to be more careful where they source, to pay their workers better, to pay more attention to the environment. And so trade could be a tool, in fact, to spread good behavior. And blame trade is really working the other way.
Okay. I think we're going to start questions.
Thank you. So thank you, all distinguished speakers. I'm wondering, we are all, in this room, part of a group of people, I guess, who have benefited enormously from globalization. For myself, I've been a banker working in Asia for 30 years. I'm now teaching economy. And all of us, I think, one by one, in our jobs and so on, we have benefited. So I wonder, doesn't this make us a little bit blind to the standpoint, to the way that other people see things? You all mentioned that there are social issues, and we all believe that globalization has created value and lifted people out of poverty. But, from the standpoint of people who lost their job in a steel factory somewhere in eastern France, things doesn't look the same at all. And frankly, if we've seen the way this has been dealt with, nobody has really taken these issues really seriously until recently. It's not that we ignore the social consequences. I think one of you pointed out that there was a lot of talk about protecting agriculture in some countries, but nobody, I think, anticipated the violence of the shock that China joining WTO would cause. And we didn't, frankly, initially not much was done to protect the interest of the people who lost their job in manufacturing. And there are millions of these people. And these people, and then we said, oh, there is a problem. We acknowledge there is a problem. And we said subsidies. Okay, we can address this question of inequality by subsidizing the people who lose. But the people who lose say, I don't want subsidies, I want a job. Okay? And these people vote. And I think we cannot ignore that this results in politicians being elected all across the world, in the US, in Europe, and who may well, and it's not going, we are discussing about, in theoretical terms about the merits of globalization, but that's not the way things are going to, it's not what is going to move things. And we are facing very, very serious threat in that respect. So aren't we a little bit tone deaf?
Philippe, I fully agree with what you said. It's what I wanted to explain in saying that there is pockets of disindustrialization in some part, and that the externalization process that we've been praising for firms could be seen very differently according to your position in the value chain. And I think it's interesting to see that some countries have been having a different solution to that. If you look, for example, Germany, or if you look also Japan or Korea, or even now China. China is saying that it wants to maintain a high level of industry in its country, and not, again, following the theory and textbooks and saying that, you switch from agriculture to industry and then to industry to service. It doesn't work really like that. And I think we should, in a way, change our view, and probably there will be a lot of waste of money in trying to impose again some industrial policy everywhere in the world, but at least to have this view on not only including the social consequences that you talk, but also to maintain some certain type of jobs when we build some competencies, new competencies every day in our territory, because the territory is important also to maintain a social link between people. And I think the risk is where you put it, is that if we continue in that direction, I think populism will come back, and we are already seeing it everywhere in Europe or in the world. So yes, in a way, I think it's also. I think we all of them said that this type of globalization that we've been witnessing should change and should become, in a way, different from the one we've been witnessing, which was a little bit salvage in a way.
I'll try to be brief. This morning, a gentleman in the audience mentioned that there were very few Chinese people among us today. So please allow me to impersonate a Chinese, if there was a Chinese in the audience, possibly what he would say. I will limit my remarks to 3 of them. First is about a dirty word. The second remark will be about the food recipe. And the third one about the watermark of all the papers you are reading. About a dirty word, you have praised globalization. And I would like, as a Chinese, to congratulate you for not pronouncing the dirty words that, as Chinese, we don't want to hear at all, which is reciprocity. Globalization is good as long as you don't claim for reciprocity. Sandrine, you have published a good book. There is no library, there is no book dealer in Beijing or in Shanghai who would accept to sell your book, though all the Chinese books printed in China can be sold in Paris, etc. So reciprocity is a dirty word, and I'm glad to mention that I heard only one of you mentioning the word reciprocity and once. So congratulations for that. Now, concerning the recipe, it goes back to a joke that interpreters exchanged at the time of Kissinger's first visit to China in 1972. One Chinese interpreter told the American interpreter, you know, we are really eager for transfer of technology, and we start with market survey. We learn from you in the United States. You say in English market survey, and you say technology transfer. So we observed that you American, you eat a lot of eggs and bacon for breakfast. So we agree we will develop eggs and bacon in our relationship between China and the United States. We are modest. We are just a small hen, and you are a big pig. So we will provide the eggs, and you will provide the bacon. Of course, all the story of what have been happening since in the trade imbalance is in that modest joke. And the third remark I want to mention as a Chinese today is that the watermark of the papers, I could not observe what is the watermark of the paper you are reading now. But in fact, it seems to me that it is the word sanction. It's a word that is difficult to pronounce, particularly if I'm Chinese, that I want to hear that you prepare to have sanctions against China for supporting Putin in Ukraine or whatever. So concerning the sanction, as Chinese, we are not afraid at all of sanction because we learned from Emperor Qianlong that sanction doesn't work. It was at the time 250 years ago when you may have seen at Musée Guimet, you know, there is a big engraving of one of the first successful genocide in history, the Dzungar, 1 million people killed by a few thousand Uyghur. You know, Xinjiang is Uyghur now, but it was not Uyghur before. It was the Dzungari. And the Qianlong emperor decided that he would kill 1 million Dzungar people. So he asked the Uyghur to kill them. And there is no more Dzungar in China, maybe 10,000, that's all. But I'm not talking about the Dzungar genocide by the Uyghur today. I'm talking about the fact that the Qianlong emperor, though he was very bright, thought that he needed to sanction the Western power, particularly Russia, because Russia was the most powerful invader of the Manchu Empire that over the years took out, this I will mention again tomorrow in the discussion about the next war between China and the rest of the world, is about the fact that Russia, the Tsar, took about 3.6 million square kilometers from the Manchu Empire. So the Qianlong emperor was a bit angry against the Tsar and against the British and the Dutch and so on. So the Mandarin in his council said that we need to apply sanctions to China, to Europe and the Soviet and to Russia. And the best sanction is, of course, to deprive the Westerners of eating tea and eating rhubarb, because you have to remember that the main export at that time from China to the rest of the world were tea a little bit, but a lot of rhubarb. And rhubarb was not the fruit that you eat for jam, but the roots, which were used against constipation. And this was the main disease in Europe at this time, constipation. So Qianlong was advised by some of his staff that if we deprive the British and the Russian from rhubarb, they will all die and they will be submissive. But so they stopped exporting rhubarb, which was a lot of money for import to China. It did not work. And though they were constipated, the Russian and the British did not die. So the sanction does not work. And in the mind of the Chinese leaders today, when you say sanction, they thought about Qianlong depriving the British Queen and the Russian Tsar of their rhubarb, and they did not die. So they are not afraid. We are not afraid, if I am Chinese, of any sanction. So that's the three remarks that as a Chinese.
Sorry, unable to make comments, so bright as we just heard, so it will be a very basic question. You mentioned, sir, the elephant in the room, I guess China. And you mentioned that the China part in globalization in 2008, before the financial crisis, was approximately 60% or 42%. There is another elephant who is not in the room, but behind the door yet. 1.4 billion people, China, 1.4 billion people, India. India has hardly been mentioned during your presentation, except by you, sir. My question is, it's a question, not a comment. My question is, how do you see today India's role in terms of globalization, and how do you see India's role in the near future in terms of globalization?
It's such a good question, such an easy one, of course, to answer that. No, I mean, to cut a very long story short, I think that obviously India will have an opportunity next year as a G20 chair to show what its interest and what its ideals are right now in terms of the international agenda. Now, one important point is has to do with the dependence of India and other emerging economies from financial markets, which is going to be a central place, play a central place in the agenda that India will have for the G20, and that reflects the dependency and the vulnerability that India still has from that point of view. Now, there is a second point, which is has to do with the role. Again, I mean, when I say that there was an elephant in the room, was not so much China per se, was the fact that some of these emerging economies, including, of course, starting with China, are non-democratic. And as I say, the democracy itself is the definition that we give, and some others may not agree with. But that is the elephant in the room, the political system. And obviously, India has, for many years, many decades, praised itself and presented itself as the world's largest democracy. And obviously, this is an evolving democracy is taking an evolving nature in India. This is, of course, something which has some implications for the role that India plays on the global scene. And in terms of economic policies, India is already, compared to other G20 countries, again, I mean, which is a universe which is representative of the largest economy, is already I think, together with Indonesia, by the way, and China, is the most protectionist and most restrictive country in terms of trade, in terms of services, definitely in terms of investment and in terms of IPRs. So I guess India will somehow push that kind of agenda, which has to do with the policy space, which is actually another word which we didn't use. It was win-win. It's another dirty word that we didn't use. And win-win is something that the Chinese use, and eventually, I guess, maybe other Asian countries will find their own interpretation of win-win. And I think that a lose-lose of globalization is the fact that you find spaghetti alla bolognese everywhere, except in Bologna, of course. They don't exist.
Oh, yes. My question was also related to India, which is, Andrea, kind of you put India into the basket of crises along with Brazil and Russia. And I wanted to understand why you characterize India as a potentially crisis. And then, do we actually, and then as a panel, do we think that, for example, IT services or service exports will be actually the next kind of wave of globalization and not necessarily manufacturing exports?
I mean, I didn't mean to say that India is in a crisis, but certainly the pace of convergence of India to the OECD level, the US level, whatever benchmark you choose, the pace of convergence is much slower than in the case of China. In particular, since 2001, when Jim O'Neill created the acronym BRIC. So that, from that point of view, I say that BRIC has become a China-only story. But obviously, I mean, India is not country in crisis, even if, of course, the potential of India is so huge, and still just to finish with this, so just to bring some note of optimism, India's GDP per capita after 50 years, 75 years of independence is still in US dollars, constant US dollars, 3% of the level of the United States. So the potential is huge. Yeah.
Well, thank you for finishing on this note of optimism. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists for your very rich views. And I think we are quite late already.